Great, welcome everybody. You can imagine what it took for me to get here because you probably had the same experience of making your way here. I was sitting upstairs waiting in a different room that was not mine, so thanks for the patience of me getting here and starting a few minutes late. Really excited for you to be here on this topic. I know we've got a simulcast room in the Venetian as well, so excited you could join. I can't see faces very well because of the bright lights, but I know some of you in the audience, so I'm excited to talk to you about this topic around making dollars and cents out of FinOps. This is a topic that has gotten very hot with customers. It's really important as you go through your journey, and today we're going to actually go through an entire roadmap of creating and getting started with your FinOps journey. I'll start out with a quick story, and as you think about the notion of the Roman Empire, there's a lot of correlations as you think about the breadth and influence that it's had on the modern day world. And specifically, there's a lot of lessons to be learned as we think through the Roman Empire. Specifically, there's a lot that went down to ultimately lead to the corruption, demise, and of that Roman Empire. Some of the things that there's some correlations to enterprises today. One of those, obviously, there's a lot of bureaucracy that exists in the ecosystem. There's a lot of internal focus on power that existed. There was obviously high degrees of inflation and pressure and economic uncertainty that existed. But there was also a real focus on short-term over long-term elements that drove ultimately to its demise. So as we think about forward looking a couple thousand years, and we think about how companies are dealing with some of the same issues, where organizations overspend on cloud resources, they tend to lead to financial waste. And really the session today, we're going to dive deep into ways to ensure you don't have that waste inside of your organization. My name is Chris Hennessy. I'm an enterprise finance strategist at AWS. I've worked here for 2.5 years, and in that 2.5 years, I've got to meet with over 500 customers talking about everything to do with the financial elements of engaging in the cloud. Prior to joining AWS, I spent over 20 years at Capital One and was a technology CFO, building data centers and then deprecating those data centers as we migrated and modernized to the cloud. So I'm going to share insights not only from my personal experience, but also from engaging with so many customers on the topic of FinOps. I've kept a really close eye as I've engaged with customers around what's on customers' minds. And I've seen an explosion over the last 6 or 8 months on customers wanting to learn more, ensure they're being well managed, but also the cultural and people change that comes with leading through a FinOps journey. As you think about, and I know typically when I talk to customers, there's a spectrum that exists. They're either deeply in an on-prem mindset and ecosystem and are thinking about the cloud. There are some who've moved workloads to the cloud and have already engaged and gone through that journey. And then there's some that are fully in the cloud, either in a multi-cloud configuration or engaging all in with the cloud. So we're going to talk today as we go through this spectrum about those who, kind of a 101 version and a 201 version, because I know some of you are pretty mature in your journey as we go through this. But in terms of IT financial management, some of you probably have worked in this space before the cloud. These are 3 things that clearly kind of dispel and call out the elements of before. One is kind of capital planning. I know anybody who's done any element of forecasting, trying to predict capacity for your business, it's a very hard thing to do. It's really challenging to understand what is the needs in the future, and then how do we make sure we buy the right technology and leverage that technology. Secondly is around software management. I know I can vivid memories of trying to track down who's consuming what license and in what way, and how do you best manage that. And then lastly, obviously, the notion of vendor management. I think having deals and engagement and procurement cycles with varying vendors, this is kind of what life is like before. So when customers are thinking about the cloud, I always make sure that they don't underestimate the complexity that's just embedded in the way in which they operate as they're thinking about a cloud decision. Specifically, as they go into the world of post-cloud, and I'll put these up here, the spirit of this is around cost flexibility, scalability, transparency, and simplification. As you all know, the beauty of engaging in the cloud is to take advantage of that elasticity, but you need to architect for that. You can't just assume it's going to happen. So I see a lot of customers as they move to the cloud, they kind of bring an on-prem mindset to the cloud and then wonder why they're not seeing the savings or what's expected through that. But you can unlock all the value that's on here as you go through this, but there's some steps you need to take to ensure you can unlock that value. So we're going to talk through all of that in our session here today. As you think about customer engagements, I know I'm always engaging with customers and kind of what's on their mind. I wanted to share what needs to change, but also what doesn't need to change as you go through your cloud transformation. Some of the first things on the change side is the cultural elements of this. I can't underestimate, as you can imagine, if you were to go talk to 500 different customers and get a sense for what does change look like in your organization? How do you manage financials as you go through this? There's a lot of elements of collaboration that needs to occur. Anytime I walk into a meeting, usually with technical leadership, and I ask them who's their finance support and are they going to join, some of them don't even know who supports them in finance inside of their organization. There's obviously others on the spectrum where there's a tight partnership, but this is going to forge a tight relationship as you go through a cloud journey, which is a really positive thing. Secondly is you need to learn new skills and new capabilities. Anytime I meet with a CFO who just is like, I don't know what I'm paying for. Like, can you help explain this bill to me? What are all these services? What are the capabilities? How do I understand how to decode this of who's actually consuming it inside of the organization? So we're going to talk about the steps to take to ensure you have that transparency, but you can't just assume you move to the cloud and then you fully are conversant in understanding how to read and decompose the bill. And then a huge element that I see with customers is not having the mindset that needs to change as you move to a variable model and pay as you go. There's a big benefit in that in terms of you can scale, but usually finance people get a little worried when they hear variable cost. There's elements of unpredictable nature of that. How do you get a better sense of what's there? And how do you make sure you move away from month-end monitoring and move to more real-time monitoring as you go through this? Anytime I see a customer and I say, how do you review your cloud bill? And they talk about their month-end process, I always get a little bit worried. You've got to do things in a little more real-time nature because the variable nature can change things through time. But not everything needs to change as you go through this journey. Some of the things that stay the same, all customers expect and business leaders expect that single pane of glass. They don't care if you're hybrid, if you're multi-cloud, if you're whatever the configuration. They want all of this data synthesized in a way they can make decisions and informed decisions. And that doesn't change, irregardless of whether you're in the cloud or not. That existed before. The need to forecast and predict is always important. So that doesn't change. The way you do it may change as you go through this transformation, but the need to forecast exists in both worlds. And then lastly, allocations. Usually when you say allocations, people either cringe and get little chills down their back. I know I get excited. I love allocations because ultimately it's a way in which you can get the right decision makers to get the right information. So we're going to talk about some of the best practices of allocations as we go through this, of what we've seen with our customers in our ecosystem. And I see some people taking pictures. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, I would love to send you this content. So this is wide open. So I will send you this content if you're interested. I don't know if we make it available for all. So as we go through FinOps, there's a lot of definitions that are out there. There's really three components for me as I think about FinOps in the way in which it works, and I'll kind of put up my viewpoint on this, fairly consistent to anything else you would read. The first is this notion of managing and optimizing. You've got to have a way in which you are kind of actively managing this and ensuring you're thinking of the financial elements, both of the dev side, but also the financial side. The second is the collaboration piece. This is a big unlock of things that I love about FinOps, is the collaboration between the business and product teams, the IT teams, and the finance teams. There's a need to work together to solve this, and I think that joint partnership is a key element as you read through it. And then lastly, this all has to be linked back to business value. That's for the sake of what are you doing this. It's not about IT being a cost center and worrying about cost, which is important. It's about what value are you deriving for your organization. So I thought it would be helpful just to level set in terms of kind of my viewpoint on FinOps. There's obviously a lot of great resources out there, but those key elements tend to be consistent as you look at the definitions that are out there. One framework I'll leave you with, and I'll kind of end with this as well, to think about is kind of what's your mindset, what's your skill set, and what's your tool set. That framework is a framework I use when I talk to customers around trying to decompose and understand what are the dynamics around how FinOps works within their organization. Do they even have that function? Sometimes it's just loosely coupled roles and people who do that. But this framework, I think, could be valuable for you as you start thinking about your own organization and ways in which you may need to change things as you go through it. Last thing I do before we're going to dive deep, and I decided to go pretty broad on this versus go, it's a balance of deep and broad. So the pace may pick up here as we go through this, but my hope is as you think through the benefits, and I'll put all these up there, none of these are going to surprise you as you think about the benefits of FinOps and the ecosystem that's out there. This is all about traceability and transparency. This is all about helping to hold people accountable. And it's also about minimizing waste. Like spending money in the cloud isn't a problem, but wasting money is. And really the passion and mission of FinOps teams is to ensure you're using the company's resources effectively, but you're also delivering the value that's expected as you go through it. So we're going to dive now into how do you implement FinOps. A lot of times I have conversations and I walk into organizations and I'll ask them, do they have a FinOps function? Some of the answers range from, we have people who really care about it, but they're not really a formed team, to people, especially depending on the size of the organization, they have a fully dedicated team that are tied to this. Usually, and I'm sure as some of you can attest in your organizations, these are still pretty small teams. So these are not large-sized teams inside of organizations. So I'm going to talk about team composition and the elements and how you can best implement it. And we'll start out on the starting side, and you can, I have elements and slides for each one of these, but this is all about establishing the foundation. How do you form a team? What are the norms you should have? What are the ways in which you should operate? And ultimately, how do you ultimately get visibility into what's going on within your cloud cost management? Next is all around growing the element. How do you then expand after that foundation to formalize things, make some tool selections, really think about and make some decisions that are really important around how we're going to plan, how we're going to allocate, how are we going to support the P&Ls that are out there. So really excited about that. And then lastly is scale. This is probably the biggest opportunity I see when I talk to customers, is they can create kind of localized ways to manage things, but when you need to scale it to a large development community, an organization, sometimes it's brittle as you go through that. So what are some of the practices of scaling out there in the industry? How do you think about this notion of executive sponsorship and coverage? Because FinOps teams can be hard to work in if any of you are on those teams, because sometimes it's an uphill battle to get the organization to care about some of the recommendations that are in there. So really going to talk about ways you can scale as you go through this. So first up, start. You're going to see the same 30% in three different stats. The first is, and you can see specifically this is from Accenture, but AWS research is right in this range, 20 to 40%. 30% reduction in TCO by moving to the cloud. That sounds great. I want that. I would want that for my organization. And I think that's what a lot of you hear, obviously from AWS and other cloud providers, which is coming to the cloud will enable you to reduce TCO. So that's the first 30%. The next 30% is the number of organizations that know where their cloud spend is going. So this is not likely a metric that's more as positive as the last one. There's just a lot of questions companies have around, I know I'm paying for services, but who's consuming those services and how do I better understand what's there? So this is not a big vote of confidence in the current state of elements that exists out there. And then the last is, in this report from Flexera, is how much waste is in a typical organization? And I know I always kind of ask and probe in this question, and I've seen anywhere between 20 and 30% as I ask this, but it's the same 30%. So if you're paying for your, in this case, AWS ecosystem, and there's embedded waste in there, if you made a conscious choice about that waste, that's probably not a problem. But if you're not making a conscious choice about it, it's a big opportunity for efficiency inside of the organization. So that's the assessment and awareness side. Next up is a little bit on the cross-functional team side. As I mentioned, there tends to be three kind of legs of the stool as you think about this: finance, IT, and business. There's important roles for each of them as you think through this, especially when you think about, from a software engineering standpoint, leveraging agile principles. Some of the best FinOps team leverage those agile principles, how they operate as well inside of the organization. But the alignment, the data, and the insights is the key. There's an element of a flywheel element of how do you ensure that you're giving transparency, using valuable information to then inform the insights to drive action inside of the organization. So as you think about this element, it's an important thing to consider. One framework I'm going to do after each one of these slides, you'll see, is this thing called cracking the code. These are kind of little tidbits and advice that I'll share as I go through this. And typically for this one, teams typically form organically for FinOps. It's passionate people in each one of those job families that are interested to do the right thing for the organization. And sometimes they don't even know that they exist in their passionate views. So finding ways, typically in a virtual way, for them to work together is what I see. You'll eventually mature to a dedicated team for a large enough scale, but usually it's a virtual team of passionate people in both business, IT, and finance of how that comes together. So that's the first cracking the code. Next up are around objectives. And in any good team, you need some guardrails or principles to leverage as you operate. I just captured what I typically hear from organizations around their FinOps functions. This is just not an exhaustive list, but kind of a starting point I thought I would share with you. One is, how do you build awareness around financial principles in the company? Next is around visibility, and how do you gain insight into who's spending it and in what way? Waste is the next one, so optimization. What are ways by which you can drive cost savings? I'll talk a little bit later, but I'm pretty passionate and have a passionate view around who in the organization should be focusing on this, between executives and the developers. Who are the people who should be focusing on it? Reporting and alerting is a big element, so you need to have a clear objective tied to that, as well as a communication strategy. This is probably one of the biggest gaps I see in FinOps teams. Not to bring myself down, but finance people tend to not be the best at communicating elements. Software engineers, you can make your own assessment if you fall into that category or not. But leaning on experts and being really deliberate around a communication strategy so you can celebrate the wins. When you drive a big efficiency, sometimes if you don't tell those stories inside of your organization, it diminishes the value and the impact that FinOps is having. So it's really important to think about your communication strategy as an objective. So the cracking the code for this is make sure objectives are written in pencil. Nothing needs to stay constant forever. This notion of revisiting this and staying true to the agile principles holds true here as well. But I think having an element on the front end of that cross-functional team aligning on some objectives and truing back to those principles and objectives as they're operating is a great best practice as you think about operating a team. Next is visibility. This is a big opportunity as you think about engaging in FinOps and the specifics around it. I just included my top 5 that I hear from my own experience in customers. So first is around visibility and reporting. There's obviously a ton of services and platforms that are out there. I'll talk about those later. There's also elements of behavior. You'll see the business intelligence reporting. Most companies have BI reporting capabilities already for things outside of IT, so it could be a good opportunity to integrate this together, but you have to have visibility and monitoring on your cloud data. Next is account and tagging strategy. This is like my first conversation with a customer is what's your account structure look like inside of AWS? And usually there's a technical blast radius security lens on that. There's typically not a financial reporting lens that exists on that account structure. So you've got to couple that account structure along with tagging strategy. And specifically as you think about tagging, most engineers in my experience don't like tags. They'd rather not consider or focus on that. They want to develop the features and capabilities. So being really deliberate about required tags and optional tags and then how do you best adhere to that is a big deal. I just met with a customer last week and I asked this question of what's your tagging strategy, and I think 40% of their infrastructure was tagged. The rest was untagged. So we're going to talk a little bit later around some of the KPIs that I would encourage you to consider through this. One of those is what's the percentage of your taggable resources that is actually tagged, because you really need to be tied into the specifics around that. Thresholds and alerting, this goes a long way. This is the kind of the scale element I mentioned. Using technology for this is really important. There's tons of great reporting capabilities that are out there. But alerting, you don't need to focus on everything. You need to focus on the things that matter. And alerting and push capabilities go a long way towards doing that. Next is allocations, and again, getting transparency to a lower level. We're going to talk about chargeback and showback a little bit later. Every company has its own desire of how much they want to do and don't want to do in that space. But really the power of using the transparency in cloud is understanding how is this contributing to the product profitability or business line profitability of that organization. And then lastly is cost reviews. Typically, I know in my experience, Integrating IT, cost management, information, and cloud data into what you already do is a good idea. Sometimes cloud, one of the KPIs I like to think about is how much is infrastructure as a percent of total IT spend. That gives you a sense of magnitude. And typically early in your journey, cloud's a smaller dollar amount, so it tends to not get the focus on the early journey. But I would elevate kind of insight into the cloud and some of the elements. You'll see I included the league table example in there. I know we had a lot of success with that in my past life, which is who are the top 10 most efficient application teams, who are the top 10, the bottom 10 least. You start showing league tables to developers or leaders, you're going to start getting action in that regard. So think about the power of reporting and the power of using some of the data you have to drive insight and action inside of the visibility side. So the cracking the code here really ties into compliance around tagging. A lot of times organizations will just push and push and push and do back-end reporting on taggable resources. One company I met with just decided if required tags aren't there, your environment's going to be deprecated every single day. Well, guess what? Software engineers learn really quickly. If their environment goes away, they're going to comply to what's there. So thinking about opt-in versus opt-out and how can you use governance to your benefit is a really powerful way to get to the outcomes. And again, be really cautious to use this only when it's really needed, not all the time. Next up is around training. I pulled this one out framework-wise. I'm sure you all can attest to this as you think of this. And especially like, I'm gonna say this is a lecture, but a speaking part like this, you're gonna remember some of it. But if you get hands-on learning, you're gonna remember a lot of how this is done. So as you think about training, obviously I think there was 6 reInvent FinOps sessions from either partners or this one across the ecosystem. I'd go back and watch those. I think that's a great way. Kind of the holy grail book of anybody who's done FinOps is JT's and Mike's book. I know I'm actively leveraging it myself, and customers do a lot, which is really powerful. AWS actually has a lot of free training, and this is one. There's a one out there called AWS Cloud for Finance Professionals. 100% free, will walk you through all the elements of what you need to know around how to manage AWS and the billing and the elements of the cost management. So really take advantage of free training as you move down the scale. The foundation, I know many of you may be engaged or know about the FinOps Foundation. AWS just recently joined up with the other cloud providers in that regard. There's so many opportunities of both certifications and programs through that ecosystem. It's a resource I'm advocating for my customers as I engage with them. Communities and forums, I know there's big Slack communities that some people engage in. It's a great way to share an external viewpoint and get a best practice that's there. And then lastly is hands-on. I know training programs have sandbox environments where you can get that. I know as an analytical financial person, just give me the curve file, the cost and usage report, and let me start having fun slicing and dicing this and beginning to understand and decompose it. So I think that gets you to some of the more practice doing side of this. But as you think through this learning pyramid, I would think through in your organization, what are the ways by which you're taking advantage and bringing your people along as you go through this, especially as you think of the training required around understanding cloud financials. And mentorship. Sorry, I did not end on the last one. So peer-to-peer, this is one thing I do a lot, and I would encourage you to ask your AWS account team if you leverage AWS, is let me talk to a peer who's also in the same either vertical, maybe not in the vertical, you want to talk to somebody outside of it, but help me make a connection to somebody else who does my job is a really powerful way to learn about. And what I've noticed personally is most anybody's open to helping others in a non-compete situation. A lot of this is just FinOps people wanting to help other FinOps people, so I would definitely encourage you to do that. So to crack the code here is spend time with others. Don't do this alone. There's a big power in working with people and having some shared objective. One company decided to dedicate one Friday a month within their finance and IT team to invest in yourself. Use that as a way for people to work together. I think partnering with somebody on this learning journey could be a good accountability partner, but also can give you multiple perspectives as you go through it. All right. We're going to go to grow. Next up is around the team. So I'll pull this is like a pro forma of a large enterprise team. So don't get overwhelmed if you're the only FinOps person on your team. But I thought it would be helpful to call out what I typically see in organizations around the construct. So we'll start at the top. There tends to be a lead, and the size of the company and the size of spend is why I have so many different job titles there. So it could be a manager, director, VP, whatever the construct is there. You'll see right below that, The team that started originally when I was at Capital One, it started mostly in finance and then it morphed to IT. You'll see 70% is the stat out there of FinOps that resides within IT. Number 2 is finance. Number 3 is procurement, as you think about that whole ecosystem. But really the key for me on the FinOps lead is being kind of a champion inside of the organization, somebody to advocate for this being a really pressing item. The second row is a blend of engineers, analysts, and both data analysts, and then sometimes you'll see architects and the engineers as well. Typically, and I put in there, it's a virtual team. There's sometimes our shadow finance teams in IT that I know I meet with plenty of customers in that regard. They have their own analytical person, but most times it's a virtual team. Finance resides in finance, IT resides in IT. That's typically there for career pathing purposes and enabling them to give flexibility. But it is bringing the skills of data analytics, data visibility, the analytical mindset of an analyst, but an engineer who can really transform the way this operates. And then lastly is some form of a champion. This doesn't have to be called a champion. It doesn't have to be that formal. But for me, as you think about senior level ownership and accountability, having a CTO, a CIO, or a CFO be really passionate about a FinOps team goes a long way to getting the air cover and the action when you have recommendations and ideas. So thinking about a champion, if you maybe have that loosely coupled team, but there's no champion in your organization, I would encourage you to maybe ask somebody to be the champion and outline some of the roles and responsibilities as you go through that. Because sometimes you'll get blockers and you need to escalate and get some support as you go through it. So this is the formalization of team that I typically see, and the cracking the code here is start small and expand. There's no right size for any one organization. They're typically, from my experience, I rarely see an organization more than 5 to 6. Some of the largest enterprise I've seen maybe a little bit more, but it's usually 1 to 4 resources on these teams. These aren't massive teams, but really think about the value, just like you would think of in a procurement organization. If you can deliver more value, we can add a resource to the team. One company I met with had a 3X rule, where we're willing to add a FinOps resource, but they had to deliver value 3 times their cost. So if you can drive the savings and efficiency, we're more than willing to expand the team. So think of that kind of a construct if you're trying to build the case for building out your FinOps team. It's a lot of me talking, so we'll keep rolling here. So tooling. Tooling's a big question as you go through this. Obviously, AWS, I just put the top 3 kind of tools that are out there. If you've leveraged AWS, you likely have leveraged these 3, Cost Explorer, Kudos, and the Kerr file. Kerr is kind of the base level data, and most people love to ingest that and leverage that in a base way. But there's also a lot of reporting that if you wanted to leverage Kudos and Cost Explorer, there's a GUI interface you can easily leverage as you go through that. But most customers aren't just only on AWS. So this tooling, while AWS is leaning in more to try to make multi-cloud more of a consideration through this, there's still room for growth in that area. So as you think about the flip side, which is partner tooling, and I just took this directly from the FinOps Foundation website, so that this is not me sponsoring any of these companies, so just be clear about that. But homegrown is number 1 when I engage with customers specifically. And that's because a lot of these tools, either AWS or partner tools, don't fully meet their needs. So they're ultimately trying to do custom builds. I've met with 3 customers this morning to talk about FinOps. All 3 have homegrown solutions. I don't think that's probably the right long-term strategy, but that definitely is the current strategy that customers are leaning in on because they're not meeting those needs. The other reason I think a lot of companies go this route is a lot of the pricing for some of the partner tools I'll talk through is a % of your cloud spend. And as you think about that, the more you spend in the cloud, these bills can get pretty large, so there's this balancing act of value versus cost as you go through it. I'll pull up the other ones. These are the ones that come up the most. I would say for me personally, Cloudability and Cloud Health come up a lot. You'll see also Datadog, Splunk, Cloud Zero is one I know it's come up pretty often recently as well. And you'll see this is a reference from the FinOps report of 2023. These are the typical tools, at least for AWS and or the ecosystem. But I would really encourage you as you go through this on the cracking the code here, is there's no one size fits all. Everybody's always looking for what is the best in breed. And a lot of that depends on the company and how they're going to use it and the way in which they're going to leverage it. So I would be comfortable making sure you're aligning the tool to the needs you have. Be very clear about the goals and the objectives. Don't just assume if I buy a tool, it'll solve my problems. And I know all of you have enough experience to know that's the case. So We're going to dive now into forecasting and allocations. I'm actually going to go deeper into this next year. If you connect with me, I share a lot of content on LinkedIn because these are meaty topics, and I can't do it justice just within the short time I have here. But as you think about forecasting, the need to predict is a big desire for a lot of companies. They want to know what are we going to consume and how do I plan for that. So I just did a small kind of crawl, walk, run construct of what I typically see with customers around their maturity of forecasting through that. The first is crawl, and usually it's some element of run rate or time series forecasting. That's what it is. What's the burn rate we've seen? What do we expect as we go forward? They're looking at trends through that, but as all of you know, especially depending on where you are in your journey, you're not getting any new input for growth or optimization or things that could change. So this tends to not be the most accurate way, but it's a great way to start out, which is, hey, here's the trends we've seen, here are the trends we expect to know. Just know there's a wide range of variance in this kind of a model, because depending on if you're just onboarding, sometimes you can get out of whack as you go through that. So it's a good way to start. It's usually done centrally, but you have an opportunity as you get more workloads to improve and leverage that. The next is this notion of beginning to get inputs. And the Pareto principle is something I preach pretty heavily when I talk to people about cloud. This works out pretty well anytime I review anybody's cloud bill, which is 20% of the apps account for 80% of the cost. It's pretty close almost every single time. So as you think about that, take advantage of that from a forecasting standpoint. Dive into just maybe the top 10 apps, top 5 apps, or maybe top 20% apps. Maybe partner with those application owners to understand what inputs do you need? How do you predict their demand in the future? What services, and we're at reInvent, there's going to be a bunch of new services. What services are you going to leverage? How do we plan for that? They're great questions to ask. There's also Amazon Forecast that does some machine learning and time series forecasting that exists there. So AWS does have some tooling, but the key difference here is you're starting to get external input about future plans. That's the big difference on this one. And then on the run side, you tend to think about how do we use machines to do some of this work on our behalf? What are the ways in which you can leverage machine learning models and algorithms to do some of this? There's always going to be human judgment, because not all variables, but you'll see if you can start ingesting some of the key variables of seasonality over whatever duration, some economic indicators, and then business performance, which is a key element. A lot of companies will use ratios around how much is revenue growing, how much is a key business metric growing, how's that going to change our cloud posture, which is really important. The other thing I would consider as you go through this and mature is a lot of finance teams, they love to do push-down targets. If anybody here has worked with it, like, oh, well, I think you can be more efficient next year. Let's give you a 5% kind of task or target to go after that. It tends to not be backed with anything, but I think optimization expectations is a reasonable one to have for development teams. But also AWS pricing changes. AWS has obviously been highly committed toward price reductions through time. There's always a kind of a change every year of price and performance. How do you plan for price reduction? Some companies do, most companies don't. But if they do account for it, sometimes they use that and put it to the side to redirect as a capacity plan for the others. So next, we're going to talk about allocations. This is kind of the way you can assign cost inside of your organization. And I'll talk about some of the practices that I see here. Anybody who's lived in allocation world knows you can really quickly tip the scale to way more complexity for the value delivered. It's this really fine balance you need to have and strike that balance. So really be mindful of that balancing act. Know if you're going too far into this ecosystem and spending time on things that don't matter, you probably need to pull back as you think about that balance. The second is around automated inputs. Anybody that's done allocations or used information knows how painful the process can be if you're relying on others for information. So one organization I met with, they basically said our driver pool can only be things that we can automatically generate. So if it can't come from a system, we can't use it as a driver, no exception. And I think that was really powerful as I heard that, because it puts a really big onus on automation through the process, which is a really powerful way to do it. Next is don't underestimate the importance of explainability. If anybody's had to sit in front of a product leader, a business line president, or a CEO and explain what's being allocated to their P&L, you'll know really quick you need to be able to explain this in a way that's digestible and easily understood, especially by non-technical leadership. So you can't get in the weeds and get lost in this allocation or this shared platform or network costs here. It gets so confusing. You need to be able to think about explainability. So as you think about your allocations methodology and approach, explainability has to be a key consideration through this, because if you can't explain it, you can't drive the right action. And I think this is something I know a lot of companies spend time on. Consistency matters more than precision. I know as a finance person, you're always looking for accuracy and trying to get it just right. But having so much change potentially throughout a fiscal year can really change the dynamics for organizations. So I think a best practice here is an annual kind of consideration around allocation methodologies. How do you revisit things that you want to change? But consistency for that business matters more than precision. And sometimes that's hard for organizations to keep an eye on. And then lastly is, again, I'm going to continue to emphasize this notion of peer organization engagement. Find someone who does your job or a peer and try to have a conversation around forecasting and allocations. Most are going to share your pain a little bit on some of these elements, but a lot will have really great ideas that you can consider as you go through your journey. So the takeaway here is obviously think about controls and limits. Think about escalation as you go through balancing both allocations and going through forecasting. In terms of scale, the question, one of the things, and this is only, I moved into AWS away from leading a team and helping a customer solve their problems to helping organizations solve theirs. What that's taken me away from is data and numbers. So I miss this. So anytime I get the opportunity to review an AWS bill, I get really excited. So if anybody here wants me to review their AWS bill, I'd love to do it. Shoot me a note. But I basically summarized in reviewing those bills, what do we typically see in terms of where the biggest opportunities are for optimization? So the first one is how you buy. And I know we've got some great partners here who do this as a service. But as you think about how do you get as much coverage as possible inside of your organization to get the biggest discount possible in this? I won't go deep into it, but there's multiple ways you can buy. In this case, take server capacity. You can buy it on demand, which is kind of retail rates. There's reserved instant savings plan and spot. All kinds of ways to go through this, but as you think about it, you want as much coverage as possible, get the biggest discount possible. And when I review people's bills and see they're 90% on demand and they have consistent workloads through time, I'm just like, why are you not doing something different around how you procure this? So really think hard and fast. I know some companies get hard to make a commitment. That sounds very scary and they're worried about making that commitment. But to the same extent, if you have consistent workloads, it's kind of a no regrets move. And as I mentioned, this is a place, if you're interested, there's tons of great partners that will help support you through this. Next up is over-provisioned resources. EC2 right-sizing is the classic case here. So I know in my experience, as you move from on-prem and you go to the cloud, you don't change your mindset of elasticity and scalability. You just say, I want an extra large. Give me an extra large. Why do you need the extra large? I just want the extra large. Like, I just want to plan for the unknown. Well, that's not what's needed as you go to the cloud. You need to take advantage of that. So I think thinking about this notion of over-provisioning, looking at utilization rate is a big KPI that I focus a lot on, which is what is a target utilization rate that makes sense for your workload? And then how are you different than that to understand a waste? But I would say EC2 right-sizing, if you look at any bill, is up there in a big opportunity for organizations. Next is around storage. You'll hear sound bites out there, storage free, storage is like free. Anybody's reviewed AWS bill, there's a cost to storage. And taking advantage of automated tiering is really, really important. So keeping everything at the highest cost storage, even when it's not accessed, is not a really well-managed way to approach this. So I included kind of the S3 storage lifecycle as a perfect example. Integrating this in, it automatically, based on time and lack of use, will move to the lowest cost storage. It's a no-brainer in terms of my viewpoint, because you can always call that back to a more current version as you leverage it. Technical debt and instance of family comes up for me. Sometimes people aren't rehydrating their instances with the latest images and the latest kind of EC2 dynamics. Thinking about this balance between rehydration and using the latest technology from AWS. Just because you went through and moved to the cloud doesn't mean you need to maintain and continue to modernize as you go through it. So that's one there. And then the last one is just resources that aren't used. Nights and weekends always comes up with customers. A notion around when should we use dimmer switches or turn things down. This is a perfect opportunity for the opt-in, opt-out that we talked about earlier. Don't assume people are going to turn things off. turn them off, and then have a process that they need to turn it back on. So flip the script as you think about governance as you go through this. So the cracking the code here is around constantly monitor, apply the strategies, but you need to have a culture of cost optimization as you go through this ecosystem. I'm going to pick it up because I'm behind based on the time. I'm going to pull these up. This is kind of my KPI slide. I have a lot more KPIs if anybody's interested, but as you think about visibility and optimization, I always love to narrow in on a couple of KPIs that customers should look at. One is cloud efficiency ratio. You can broaden that to IT efficiency ratio. You can broaden that to total company operating efficiency ratio. But it's how many operating costs do you have divided by the revenue of the business. That is a great way to keep an eye on, are you delivering value through revenue or cost reduction through time as you go through your cloud transformation? On the right side, I need to pick a favorite. That's always a hard thing to do. There's, I would say resource utilization rates is probably something that's under leveraged for many customers. Looking at, one, using architecture to define what does good look like in terms of utilization, but then how are you actually performing and leveraging that? There's obviously a lot of KPIs that are out there. This is an area that I get a lot of questions on. So if anybody's interested to have a deeper dive on business value KPIs, it's something I have other content on as well. So the cracking the code here is think about thresholds and targets, especially for some of these metrics. You don't have to have action on everything, but set a measure and a threshold, and then an action if that's exceeded as you go through it. I'll put it all up here, which is when I step into a company, you can imagine if you stepped into a company and have no idea what the company is like outside of what you read online, you're really trying to quickly assess what is the cost culture of the company. These are the questions I ask when I come in, which is who's accountable for budgets? Like where in the organization does budget accountability exist? I always love the question to get people squirming is what happens if you don't meet your budget? And some people just look at each other as they stare there of like, what is it okay? And it's a spectrum. Some people won't have a job if you don't meet your budget. Some people, you just explain it away. It doesn't really matter. It's just kind of a guardrail. So there's a wide spectrum that exists there. But as they answer that question, and you can use these questions to ask back in your organization, it really helps give you a signal around how do I need to think about cost culture specifically around FinOps. And then the bottom one gets into the communication side, and you can ask a question, which is, what's a success or a challenge tied to cost? I met with a large bank recently in Canada, and they basically said, it's cost savings. That's the only thing that matters. It's cost savings. And I said, okay, great. But you're also migrating to the cloud. So as you're migrating to the cloud, I always ask about affordability and what are the ways by which you're migrating to the cloud. You'll hear things like the double bubble, or you'll hear things about like, how are you going through that? They're like, we just can't spend any more money. Like, it's all about cost savings, so we need to deliver value with no incremental investment. And I said, okay, just time is what you're giving up, because you need to take a bunch of resource capacity you have already to direct towards this. And that puts off other priorities in the organization. So I think asking these questions and maybe reflecting in your own organizations may give you a sense for where can I push versus where do I need to stay back a little bit around the FinOps element. You can't come in like bull in a china shop with FinOps and say you're wasting money, because sometimes a development team and what they're working on is more valuable in revenue generation than it is in just cost reduction. So it doesn't mean you have to get rid of all waste. It's a trade-off using data to make. So I included on the bottom based on these answers, and I'll just put them all up as you read through it. But you really dive deeper into these elements around, once you have answers to those questions, that'll help you inform what's your strategy and the way in which you approach it. I put in there, consider developing a RACI, which is a really powerful way, especially as you think about costs in your organization. Who's ultimately accountable for cloud cost? What's done centrally? What's done in a federated way? How do you support that in that element? These are all really big, important elements as a FinOps team around understanding the culture in the organization. So the cracking the code here is you need to tailor your approach for the organization you're in. Again, not a one-size-fits-all as you go through it. On the communication side, I'm not a huge communicator, especially in the days of proactively doing it, but I did find this model out there as I was thinking through this content, and I thought I was trying to apply it to FinOps specifically. So as you think about this ADA model, attention, interest, desire, action, this is much more of a brand communication kind of approach. But if you apply it back to FinOps, I think there's some powerful ways in which internally you can leverage some of these opportunities. On the right, I talk about recognition. Some of you, I know there's some great ways in which you've gone through this. Gamification always comes up when I talk to customers about FinOps. Trying to have fun around this. Some organizations will dedicate part of a sprint across the organization and who can develop the most savings as a % of their total spend before and have swag as they give out as that. You need to have a little bit of fun with this as you go through it. And you'll see hackathons. I know AWS has something called FinHacks where they'll come in and try to have some fun but find opportunities to both educate and drive opportunities and efficiencies through that. And then lastly, I love the bottom one, which is from a customer I engage with, where they actually take a very small portion of their IT budget, give full discretion to the CIO or CTO to leverage that, but use that as a way, not for swag or great lunches, which people love lunches and swag, but for a way for them to get more feature team capacity, more people. And developers want more developers. They want more capacity to support their business. So they actually ring-fenced a small, again, it's a small portion as a % of their spend, but had that dedicated as a little bit of a carrot that if you drive a lot of efficiency, you'll be rewarded with more capacity within your team, which is a really powerful way to deliver on the mission of their organization. So recognition goes a long way. I always talk about incentives when I talk to companies. It's really important that you consider it, but really also use this as a way for growth and development, especially FinOps teams. If you've been on a FinOps team, sometimes it's like pushing that boulder uphill. Recognition goes a long way for FinOps professionals as well, so really keep that in mind, not only on the FinOps team, but people who are emulating the right outcomes you want inside of the organization. So I'm going to quickly go through this. I debated on having a customer come up and talk about their journey on FinOps, which there's plenty of customers around that. I get asked a lot around, I want to learn from Amazon. Like learning from Amazon is something a lot of customers do. So I included a short vignette here around how does Amazon.com, which is a large consumer of AWS, how do they manage their cloud spend? Because I thought that would be really interesting to share. So specifically, there's two key elements of how Amazon.com manages their cloud spend. One is this thing called a cloud credit score. For those in the US, think of it like a FICO score. You have certain abilities to do certain things based on your FICO score that's there. The second is the cloud cost to serve, and this tends to get some of the business metrics. So on the left side, think of this as a scale from 0 to 100. And there's three key components as you look through the equation. Utilization, how much are you utilizing? How much waste do you have? So you need to have waste identification. And lastly is how different are you relative to a forecast? So you have to have a forecast to compare to. But think about the scale. So if you're between 80 and 100, you have free reign for automated approvals to leverage more cloud capacity and ecosystem. If you're between 60 and 80, your threshold decreases. You're not as responsible in how you use the cloud, so the dollar threshold of your ability to move forward is a different. Once you're below 60, you have to get a manual approval to leverage any new infrastructure in the cloud. Nobody wants to get a manual approval. So most of the teams I talk to internally, they target about 90 on that credit score, that 0 to 100, to allow for full flexibility. But guess what? If they don't have high levels of accuracy on their forecast, because there's a capacity planning consideration, obviously, for AWS through this. But also, if they don't have that waste that's addressable and take action on it, their score is going to come down. So I love this idea. It's something I've leveraged in conversation. I know it may not be fully transversant to everyone in their organization, but thinking of some kind of a scale to assess who's doing well and how do we reward that behavior versus who maybe needs some help and training as you go through this is a consideration. So the way it's leveraged is think of this on a 2x2 matrix kind of an element, cost to serve on the bottom, credit score on the top. For any one application or a product, you may see a certain vantage point. So in this case, it's a slightly higher cost to serve, kind of mid-range credit score. Through optimization, you can slide it up the scale in terms of decreasing the cost to serve, increasing the credit score. But one of the questions I get from customers a lot, especially when they've already been in the cloud, is how do I build a business case for modernization? I can make the justification of getting to the cloud, but how do I justify a modernization? And this could be an interesting construct as you think of modernization. You can bring the entire water level down in terms of that ecosystem, totally reducing cost to serve and slightly impacting that credit score. So as you think about this, they literally map out the application footprint they have It's a great way because customers always are asking us, how do I prioritize where I spend my time and effort on either optimization or on modernization? You can leverage this kind of matrix and 2x2 element that exists of either optimization, target state, or modernization. And then they literally have bubble size based on the size and the workload of what should we focus in on. So it's a perfect way to narrow in on where are the biggest opportunities, even within each quadrant. So it's a great way to drive alignment between business and IT and finance, who plays an active role in this. And I thought this framework was really helpful as you would maybe leverage this inside of your organization or some elements of it. So as I go back to mindset, skill set, and tool set, you can use that framing as you go through your transformation and think about the ways in which, where you assess on each of these dimensions and leverage that as you go through it. And lastly, this is kind of the summation of cracking the code across all of them. We had a rule in my past life that you can never remember anything that's more than 5 words. So you'll see every one of these except for one. It had to be 6 because of the in the bottom left. But I tried to get all of these to 5 words or less as a way to, as you reflect on your FinOps ecosystem, using this potentially as a roadmap and a way in which to galvanize the direction and the approach that you take. I do want to put a plug in here specifically for this cloud financial management capability assessment. This is a service that AWS provides. If you're interested, it's a survey kind of approach. You'll see it's over 40 questions. A lot of customers I meet with, they're looking to understand how are they from a maturity standpoint relative to others. So people are always looking for benchmarking as they think about their FinOps and cloud financial management elements. So you can go through, reach out to your account team. You can go through that as self-assessment. Again, it's self-reported data, so you're the one assessing it. You can have multiple people do it as well and integrate it together. It creates the spider chart and heat map around where your opportunities are. And then that's used to build the backlog for where you focus on as a FinOps team. And then a bank that I'm working in Australia, they do it once a year. So they've done 3 of these actually, and assessed every year, how is it progressing, and are we seeing the change we want in the maturity of our FinOps function inside of the organization? So not a lot of customers that I've engaged with were aware of this assessment. I would highly encourage you to take advantage of it. It's free, so there's no cost, so that's a positive that's there. But it's a great way for you to have a kind of a sense of where you need to zero in and put additional time and effort. I won't go through all this, but you all know there's so many opportunities to get involved. I know when I was a customer of AWS, especially being in finance, they typically engage, especially in my prior organization, a lot with the IT organization, a little bit less with people outside of it. So one of the first things when I joined AWS is the account team wanted to talk to me. That was supporting me. I'm like, oh yeah, what do you want to know? And they're like, how did we do as an account team? Which obviously these were all great people. I was like, but me outside of IT, I didn't ever hear a lot of opportunities. And I think there's a big opportunity, especially now that I'm inside of AWS, I'm kind of advocating for all. Be really upfront about what your needs are. Be really clear that if you want a connection or a peer connection, just ask your account team. Hey, can you go find 3 other people and 3 other companies that do my job? It's not a question you normally probably would think about asking AWS, but the AWS and the leadership principles, they are obsessed around their customers. They do want to help you. I would take advantage of that if I was a customer in a positive way. But these are just examples as you go through this. My job, as I mentioned earlier, I just engage with customers and help them on their journey. So if anybody's interested to connect, I'm happy to make a connection through that. Here's my LinkedIn information. If anybody wants to connect, feel free to connect. I will share content as I go through that. If you want to send me a DM through LinkedIn, I'll send you these materials if that's valuable. And I think the video will be available as well. I did want to put a plug in for the survey. This is a new piece of content based on just conversations I've had over the last year and a half. So if there's maybe a topic I didn't cover that you'd love to be included or something to go deeper in, this is kind of a backbone that I'm going to leverage in the beginning of 24 to go deeper in terms of content creation, both with partners who support FinOps ecosystems, but also inside of AWS and what's there. So I'm going to hang around here afterwards if anybody wants to catch up. I would love to catch up, but I appreciate the time, and thanks for coming out to Caesars and to Venetian. So thanks so much.